As the days went by, Jude started noticing another troubling sign. Cynthia began spending more time in private, locked away in the bedroom or on the other balcony, talking to someone on the phone. She would laugh and smile, her mood completely different from the coldness she showed her family. Jude and Cynthia had what many people called a perfect marriage. They lived in a big house in Owerri with their two beautiful daughters, Omasiri and Omalicha. Jude worked hard and his business was doing well. He could provide everything his family needed, from fancy clothes to delicious meals and even vacations. Cynthia, on the other hand, loved the life of comfort that Jude's hard work provided. She enjoyed dressing up, going out with friends, and showing off her life online. For years, their home was filled with laughter, love, and happiness. Jude thought he had it all: a beautiful wife, wonderful children, and a successful business. Cynthia played her role well. She always smiled in public, told everyone how lucky she was, and acted like the perfect wife. But deep down, she had never loved Jude for who he was. She only loved the money and lifestyle he provided. Their daughters, Omasiri and Omalicha, adored their father. He always found time to play with them, help them with their homework, and tell them stories before bed. To the girls, their father was their hero. Their mother, Cynthia, was a different story. She cared more about how she looked in pictures than how her children were doing in school. She often forgot to pack their lunch or drop them off at school on time. But the girls didn't say much. They had learned to rely on their father. One day, everything began to change. Jude had problems at work. His company, which had been doing well, suddenly started losing money. He had to spend more time at the office, trying to fix things, and the stress weighed heavily on him. He would come home late, tired and worried, hoping to find comfort and support from Cynthia. But that didn't happen. Instead of being there for him, Cynthia started pulling away. She no longer waited for him to come home with a smile, and she stopped cooking his favorite meals. She would spend hours on her phone, chatting with her online friends and posting pictures on social media. In her posts, she talked about how much she loved her family, how perfect her life was, and how happy she felt. But in reality, she barely paid attention to her family. One evening, after a long day at work, Jude came home hoping to talk to Cynthia. He had been feeling down lately, and all he wanted was to sit with his wife and share his thoughts. When he walked into the living room, he saw Cynthia on the couch, her phone glued to her hand, her eyes focused on the screen. "Cynthia, can we talk?" Jude asked, trying to get her attention. "Not now, Jude, I'm busy," she replied without looking up. Jude frowned. "Busy with what? You've been on that phone for hours." Cynthia sighed, clearly annoyed. "I'm replying to my fans. They need my advice." Jude shook his head. "Your fans? What about your family, Cynthia? What about me?" "Jude, you're always complaining," Cynthia snapped. "Can't you see I'm doing something important here?" "Important?" Jude's voice rose slightly. "Our family is falling apart, Cynthia. The girls hardly see you. You don't even ask how my day was anymore." Cynthia rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, Jude. You are just overreacting. Everything is fine." But everything wasn't fine, and Jude knew it. That night, he went to bed with a heavy heart. He stared at the ceiling, wondering what had happened to the woman he married. Where had things gone wrong? The next morning, the situation got worse. Cynthia forgot to wake early to prepare the girls for school. Omasiri and Omalicha had to quickly get dressed on their own while Jude made breakfast for them. As he served the food, he glanced at his wife, who was still lying in bed, scrolling through her phone. "Cynthia, aren't you going to help the girls get ready for school?" Jude asked, trying to remain calm. "I'm tired, Jude." She replied without moving. You handle it. Jude clenched his fists, feeling the frustration build up inside him. He took a deep breath and focused on the girls, making sure they had everything they needed for the day. As he dropped them off at school, Omalisha, the younger daughter, asked, Daddy, why doesn't mommy take us to school anymore? Jude didn't know how to answer. He didn't want to say any bad thing about their mother. So he smiled and said, Mommy's just tired, sweetie. She will come with us next time. But deep inside, Jude knew that Cynthia's behavior was becoming a problem. When he got back home, he found her still in bed, her eyes glued to her phone. He decided to talk to her again, hoping she would listen this time. Cynthia, can we talk now? He began, sitting on the edge of the bed. Cynthia looked up, frowning. About what now? Our family, Jude said. You've changed, Cynthia. You are not the same woman I married. You don't take care of the kids. You don't spend time with me. And all you do is to stay on your phone. What's going on, Cynthia? Cynthia sat up, looking annoyed. Jude, I'm tired of all this. You act like if it's my fault that things aren't perfect anymore. Maybe I'm just tired of this whole marriage thing. Jude's heart sank. Tired of the marriage? What do you mean? I mean, maybe I don't love you anymore. Cynthia said bluntly. Maybe I never did. Those words hit Jude like a punch to the chest. He stared at her, shocked and hurt. You don't love me? Cynthia shrugged. I don't know, Jude. Maybe I only married you because it seemed like the right thing to do at that time. Jude stood up, feeling like the ground was shaking beneath him. How can you say that, Cynthia? We've built a life together. We have two beautiful children. So what? Cynthia snapped. That doesn't mean I have to stuck in a life I don't want. Jude couldn't believe what he was hearing. He felt like his whole world was falling apart. He had given everything to this marriage, to his family, and now Cynthia was telling him it was all a lie. For the next few days, Jude tried to hold things together for the sake of his daughters, but Cynthia's behavior only got worse. She would spend hours chatting with strangers online, talking about her perfect life while ignoring her real life problems. She hardly talked to Jude, and she didn't even notice when he was home or not. One afternoon, Jude picked up Omaseli and Omalicha from school, and the girls looked sad. Omaseli spoke up first. Daddy, why doesn't mommy love us anymore? Jude's heart broke at those words. He pulled his daughters into a hug and said, Mommy loves you, my angels. She's just going through something right now. But even as he said those words, Jude wasn't sure if they were true. Cynthia had become a stranger in her own home, and Jude didn't know how to fix it. Something had to change, but he didn't know what. And so the perfect family Jude thought he had was slowly crumbling before his eyes, and he had no idea how to stop it. Days passed, and the once happy home continued to change in ways Jude could hardly believe. Cynthia, who used to be an active part of their family, was now completely disconnected from their lives. Jude tried his best to hold things together, but it was as though he was the only one fighting for their marriage. His heart ached, and the tension in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Cynthia became more absorbed in her virtual world. She was always on her phone, her attention focused on social media. It was like she had found an escape from her real life responsibilities. She posted pictures and gave advice to her online followers, painting a picture of herself as a perfect wife and mother. But inside their home, everything was falling apart. Cynthia's obsession with her online presence became a full-time affair, and she spent hours scrolling through her phone, leaving her family in complete neglect. Jude's frustration grew. He could not understand how Cynthia had become so disconnected. She ignored the house, leaving Jude to handle everything, from grocery shopping to laundry. He was doing tasks that they used to do together. Even the simplest household chores became his responsibility. There were days when the dishes piled up in the sink and Jude had to clean them, not because he minded helping, but because Cynthia no longer cared. The most painful part was watching their daughters Omasere and Omalicha suffer because of their mother's actions. The girls missed their mother's presence. They didn't understand why she wasn't spending time with them anymore. They had once shared their playful moments together, but now those days seemed like distant memories. Jude often found Omalicha, the youngest, sitting alone, staring at the door as if waiting for her mother to come and play with her. But Cynthia never noticed. She was too absorbed in illusion she had created online, where her life appeared flawless. One evening, as Jude tucked the girls into bed, he looked at their sad faces and felt the weight of their disappointment. It was clear that Omasere and Omalicha were struggling to cope with their mother's absence. They didn't complain, but Jude could see the question in their eyes. Why wasn't their mother there for them? Why had she changed? He wished he had answers, but the truth was, he didn't understand what had caused the shifts either. Jude tried to keep the routine as normal as possible for his daughters. He would make breakfast, take them to school, and help with their homework. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fill the space that Cynthia had left in their lives. The emptiness in the house was undeniable. Even though Cynthia was physically present, her mind was far away, lost in a world that had nothing to do with her family. At work, things weren't going well for Jude either. His business was still facing challenges, and the stress of managing both his work and home life began to take its toll on him. He often found himself staying late at the office, not because he needed to, but because he didn't want to go home to the silence that awaited him. He missed the way things used to be, the laughter, the conversations, and the warmth that had once filled their home. But those days were gone. Cynthia's transformation was complete, and she no longer seemed interested in their marriage or their family. She had stopped caring about Jude's struggles. In the past, she would have asked him about how his days or offered words of encouragement when things were tough. Now, she didn't even notice when he came home late, exhausted from the day's work. The emotional connection between them had vanished. What troubled Jude the most was how indifferent Cynthia had become to their daughters. She rarely spoke to them, and on some days, she even forgot to ask how their school days went. There were times when Omasere would try to get her attention, showing her drawings or asking for help with school projects, but Cynthia would just brush her off, telling her to go ask her father instead. It was heartbreaking for Jude to witness, knowing that no matter how much love he gave them, he couldn't replace their mother's affection. Jude felt helpless. He had tried talking to Cynthia, hoping that something he said would break through the wall she had built around her. But nothing worked. Each conversation ended the same way, with Cynthia dismissing his concerns or telling him that he was overreacting. It was as if she had made up her mind to let go of the family they had built together. As the days went by, Jude started noticing another troubling sign. Cynthia began spending more time in private, locked away in the bedroom or on the other balcony, talking to someone on the phone. She would laugh and smile, her mood completely different from the coldness she showed her family. Jude didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Cynthia was acting like someone who had something to hide. One afternoon, Jude came home from work earlier than usual. He walked through the front door and noticed the house was unusually quiet. The girls were still at school, and he assumed Cynthia would be in her usual spot, lost in her online world. But when he checked the living room, she wasn't there. Curious, he made his way upstairs. and as he approached the bedroom door, he heard Cynthia's voice, soft and cheerful, as if she were discussing to someone she cared so much about. Jude stood there for a moment, frozen. The conversation sounded intimate, filled with laughter and playful tones, something he hadn't heard from Cynthia in a long time. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening. He didn't want to jump to conclusion, but it was hard not to wonder who Cynthia was talking to in such a loving way. Whoever it was, it clearly wasn't him. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Jude walked away from the door, deciding not to confront her just yet. He needed to be sure before he said anything. The thought of losing his wife completely, even after all the pain she had caused, was unbearable. But he also knew he couldn't live in denial any longer. Things had gone too far, and the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. As Jude sat in the living room later that evening, waiting for the girls to come home from school, his mind kept returning to the earlier moment. Who was Cynthia talking to? Why had she changed so much? And what would happen to their family if the truth was as bad as he feared? The house felt empty, despite Cynthia being there. The silence between them grew louder with each passing day, and Jude could feel the distance widening. He missed the woman he had once loved, the partner he had shared his life with, but it seemed like she was no longer that person. She had become a stranger, and Jude didn't know how to reach her anymore. The situation weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he had begun to consider the possibility that their marriage might not survive. He had fought so hard to keep their family together, but with each passing day, it became clearer that Cynthia had already given up. She had made her choice, and Jude wasn't sure there was anything left he could do to change her mind. The thought of raising their daughters without her presence scared him, but he also knew that the life they were living now was not healthy for anyone. The girls needed stability, love, and care, things Cynthia no longer provided. Jude had to make a decision, one that would protect his children from the chaos their mother was creating. And so, with a heavy heart, Jude began to think about the next step. He didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: he couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The time had come for him to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Jude's suspicions grew stronger as the days went by. Cynthia continued to drift further away from her responsibilities as a wife and mother. Her behavior became even more troubling, and Jude couldn't ignore the signs any longer. He had to admit to himself that something was terribly wrong. The emotional distance between them was undeniable, and it was beginning to affect every part of their family life. Cynthia was now living in her own world, completely disconnected from reality. She no longer showed any interest in their children, Omasere and Omalicha, or in Jude himself. What made it worse was her secretive behavior. She spent more and more time locked in her room or on the phone, hiding her conversations from Jude. She would disappear for hours, leaving the house without explaining where she was going. Each time she left, Jude was left with an uneasy feeling, but he didn't have the heart to confront her yet. He was afraid of what he might discover. Cynthia's physical appearance began to change as well. She spent more time getting dressed up, wearing expensive clothes, and applying makeup. Even though she had nowhere to go, she had become obsessed with how she looked, as though she was preparing for someone else, someone Jude didn't know. Her social media was filled with pictures of herself looking glamorous and happy, while at home, everything was falling apart. Jude's concern intensified when he noticed that Cynthia wasn't just focused on social media anymore. She had started spending long hours chatting with someone online, someone who seemed to be taking up all her attention. She would smile at her phone, laugh at messages, and ignore everyone around her. The atmosphere in the house became tense. Jude could feel the weight of Cynthia's secrecy, and it was taking a toll on him emotionally. Jude began to wonder who this mysterious person was. He couldn't shake the feeling that Cynthia was hiding something from him, and the thought gnawed at him every day. Her late nights, her sudden trips out of the house, and her distant attitude all pointed to the conclusion that Jude didn't want to admit. He feared that Cynthia was seeing someone else, and the thought of it broke his heart. The children also felt the change in their mother, Omasiri and Omalicha. Though young, sensed that something was wrong. They were used to their mother's absence by now, but it still hurt them. They tried to get her attention, but it was always the same Cynthia. She had no time for them. Jude did his best to fill the gap, but he knew that a father could only do so much. The girls needed their mother, but she was no longer available to them emotionally or physically. As the situation worsened, Jude's frustration grew. He had tried to ignore the signs for too long, hoping things would get better, but they hadn't. The realization that his marriage was crumbling became too clear to ignore. He was living with a woman who had completely checked out of their life together, and it seemed like she no longer cared about the consequences of her actions. Jude began to prepare himself for the truth. He knew that whatever Cynthia was hiding would soon come to light, and he needed to be ready for it. He didn't want to lose his family, but he couldn't hold on to something that no longer existed. Cynthia had made her choice, and it was becoming clearer with each passing day. Her heart was no longer in their home, it belonged somewhere else. The final blow came when Jude noticed Cynthia planning a trip. She had been talking about it secretly, making plans behind his back. He didn't know where she was going to or why, but it was obvious that this trip had nothing to do with their family. Jude's mind raced with possibilities, and none of them were good. He knew that whatever Cynthia was planning, it would change their lives forever. Jude watched as the woman he once loved prepared to walk away from their marriage. The realization hit him so hard, but he also felt a strange sense of relief. He had been holding on for so long, hoping for a change that would never come. Now, it seemed like the end was inevitable, and all he could do was brace himself for what was to come. As Cynthia packed her bags, Jude knew deep down that their marriage was over. She had already left him emotionally, and now she was preparing to leave him physically. The woman who had once been his partner, the mother of his children, was now a stranger. The only question left was how far she was willing to go and what the consequences of her actions would be. The storm that had been brewing for so long was about to break, and Jude could feel it. All he could do now was wait for the truth to reveal itself, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Cynthia's life was now spinning faster in a direction that no one could understand, not even her. She had completely distanced herself from her husband, Jude, and her two daughters, Omasiri and Omalicha. Her focus was elsewhere, and nothing seemed to matter to her anymore. She had become entirely consumed by her secret relationship with the stranger she met online. It was clear to everyone around her that something was wrong, but Cynthia didn't care. She was lost in her world, driven by excitement and adventure, completely forgetting the responsibilities she had at home. Her best friend, Oledo, had noticed the changes in her long before Jude even started suspecting anything. Oledo had always been someone who valued family, and she couldn't understand how Cynthia had drifted so far away from hers. When Cynthia first started talking to the man online, Oledo thought it was just a phase, something harmless that would soon pass. But as time went on, Oledo became more concerned. The relationship between Cynthia and the stranger had become more serious, and Cynthia was no longer hiding it from her friend. She openly talked about how thrilling it was to speak with someone new, someone who seemed to understand her better than her own husband. Oledo, however, was not impressed. She had tried to talk sense into Cynthia many times, warning her about the dangers of leaving her family for a man she had never even met. She even reminded Cynthia of the vows she had made to Jude, the love they had shared in the past, and the importance of their children. But Cynthia was not interested in hearing any of it. She had already made up her mind. In her eyes, Jude was no longer someone she loved, and she didn't see why she should continue pretending. Oledo's advice fell on deaf ears. Cynthia refused to acknowledge the damage she was causing to her family. Every time her friend warned her about the consequences of her actions, she brushed it off, saying that she was tired of her life with Jude and wanted something new, something exciting. Oledo's words of caution became more urgent when Cynthia told her that the stranger, the man she had been chatting with for months, had invited her to Port Harcourt to meet him in person. This was no longer just an online fling. It was turning into something real, and Cynthia was willing to take the leap, regardless of the cost. Oledo was shocked. She couldn't believe that her friend was ready to abandon her family for a stranger. She begged Cynthia to reconsider, reminding her of the dangers of meeting someone she had never seen before in a distant city. But Cynthia was already too deep into her fantasy. The idea of meeting this man excited her more than anything she had experienced in years. She felt alive again, and nothing Oledo said could stop her from chasing that feeling. Oledo, growing frustrated, told Cynthia how foolish she was being. She pointed out how much she was hurting Jude and her daughters by abandoning them for a man who could be anyone. But Cynthia refused to listen. She believed she deserved happiness, and in her mind, that happiness was waiting for her in Port Harcourt. She assured her friend that everything would be fine, that she knew what she was doing, and that her life with Jude was over anyway. Despite Oledo's constant pleas and advice, Cynthia packed her bags and prepared to leave. She had made up her mind. She was ready to meet the stranger and start a new chapter, convinced that she would find the happiness she had been craving. As she packed her things, she hardly thought about her children or Jude. Her focus was entirely on the new life she imagined she would have once she met this man. Even as Oledo continued to remind her of the dangers, Cynthia was already set on her path. She didn't see the potential disaster ahead. All she could think about was the thrill of her upcoming adventure, completely blinded by her own desires. Her family, her best friend, and everything she had built with Jude no longer mattered to her. She was willing to leave it all behind for a chance at something new, even if it was with a man she had never met in real life. What Cynthia didn't know was how much trouble she was walking into. Oledo could sense that something wasn't right, but there was nothing more she could do. She had given her friend all the advice she could, but Cynthia had chosen her path, and now she was ready to leave her family behind. The consequences of her actions were looming ahead, but Cynthia, blinded by her excitement, refused to listen or see them. She was chasing a dream that would soon turn into a nightmare, and no amount of warnings could stop her. The next day, Cynthia started packing her things, preparing to leave for Port Harcourt. She was eager, her mind racing with thoughts of finally meeting the man she believed would change her life. As she stuffed her clothes into her suitcase, Jude walked into the room, his face full of confusion and hurt. "Cynthia, what are you doing? And where are you going?" he asked, his voice strained with worry. "I'm leaving," Cynthia said coldly, not even looking up from her packing. "I'm going to meet the love of my life." Jude's heart shattered. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What do you mean? We are your family, Cynthia. I'm your husband. How can you just walk away from us like this?" Cynthia zipped up her bag and stood, facing him with a look of indifference. "Jude, I don't love you anymore. I haven't for a long time. This man, he makes me feel alive. I deserve that." Jude's eyes filled with tears. Cynthia, please don't do this. Think about the girls. They need you, and I need you too. But Cynthia was unmoved. You'll be fine, Jude. You've always been strong. This marriage, it's over. I'm done pretending. Jude tried one last time, stepping closer to her. We made vows, Cynthia. How can you break them so easily? Vows? Cynthia scoffed. Anyone can make a vow just to get what they want. I'm tired, Jude. Let me go. With that, she grabbed her suitcase and walked out of the door, leaving Jude standing there, devastated and heartbroken. Cynthia boarded a bus to Port Harcourt, her excitement building as she imagined meeting the man who had promised her the world. She felt no guilt, no regret, only anticipation. She believed she was making the right decision, and this was the beginning of a new, happier life. But when she arrived at her destination, reality hit hard. The man who greeted her wasn't the charming, handsome figure she had been seeing on the pictures. Instead, a rough looking man with a cold, cruel expression stood before her. He was nothing like the person she had imagined. Her heart raced with fear as he introduced himself. I'm Beast, he said, his voice low and menacing. Cynthia's stomach turned. This can't be right, she thought. But it was. Beast was the man she had been talking to all along. And now she was in his world, a world far darker than she could have ever imagined. Beast wasn't alone. His wife, Lady G, appeared from the shadows, her eyes filled with malice. Together, they were a dangerous team, known for luring unsuspecting people into their trap. Cynthia had walked right into it, and there was no way out. They took everything from her, money, her belongings, even her phone. Cynthia was left with nothing but the cold realization that she had made the worst mistake of her life. As she sat, trembling in fear, Beast and Lady G towered over her, their faces twisted in cruel satisfaction. Cynthia's mind raced, thinking about her family, about Jude's pleas, and about how she had ignored every warning from her best friend. Now, she was trapped with no way to escape. She had left behind everything that mattered, chasing after a fantasy that had led her straight into a nightmare. Cynthia's decision to leave her family behind led her straight into a dangerous and terrifying situation. The reality of her choice had fully settled in, and it was far worse than anything she could have imagined. Alone and scared in the clutches of Beast and Lady G, she realized that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. After Cynthia left, Jude found himself struggling to manage the household alone. With his demanding job and two young daughters, Omasere and Omalicha, it quickly became overwhelming. The girls needed constant attention, help with their homework, meals, and someone to take care of them while he worked long hours. It was clear that he couldn't do it all by himself. Feeling the pressure, Jude decided to hire a nanny. He knew he needed someone trustworthy and dependable, who could provide the care and stability his daughters desperately needed. After some recommendations and interviews, he found Lucy, a kind and capable young woman. She had experience caring for children and seemed to genuinely love working with them. From that moment Lucy arrived, the household atmosphere began to change. She was warm and attentive to Omasiri and Omalicha, quickly winning their trust. She cooked their meals, helped them with their schoolwork, and made sure they felt loved and cared for in their mother's absence. Jude noticed how much calmer the girls were with Lucy around, and the weight on his shoulders started to ease. For Jude, Lucy wasn't just a nanny, she was a lifeline. With her help, the house began to feel like a home again. Though Cynthia's absence still hurt, Jude could see that his daughters were beginning to adjust. Lucy's presence brought a sense of stability that the family needed, and for the first time in a long while, Jude started to feel hopeful about the future. The warm excitement, that had driven Cynthia to Port Harcourt was now replaced by cold fear. Beast and Lady G, the couple who had lured her into their trap, had taken control of everything. Cynthia had lost her freedom, and the world she had built up in her mind crumbled before her. The promises of a new life with someone who cared for her had turned into a nightmare. She was now at the mercy of two dangerous people, far from her home and her family. Beast and Lady G weren't just ordinary criminals. They had perfected their tactics over time, targeting people like Cynthia, those who were vulnerable and easy to manipulate. Their method was simple: create an illusion of romance, draw their target in, and once they arrived, strip them of everything they had. Cynthia, blinded by her desires for excitement, had fallen right into their trap. Her belongings, money, and phone were taken almost as soon as she arrived. She had nothing left. Fear washed over her as she thought about her situation. She was in an unknown place, surrounded by strangers, with no way to reach out for help. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out how she could have been so foolish. Everything Oledo had warned her about was true. The man she thought she loved had been nothing more than a cruel trick, and now she was paying the price for her mistakes. While she sat in the rundown hideout, Cynthia's thoughts wandered back to her family. The faces of her daughters, Omasiri and Omalicha, flashed before her eyes. She had left them behind, chasing after something she thought was better. And now she couldn't even contact them. Regret weighed heavily on her heart. She had abandoned them. And for what? An empty promise. A fantasy that had quickly turned into a nightmare. Jude's face also came to her mind. She thought about how she had walked away from him, ignoring his pain and his pleas for her to stay. He had tried to warn her to stop her from making this terrible decision, but she had refused to listen. Now, she wished she had listened to him. Her marriage may not have been perfect, but it was real. She had thrown away her life for something that didn't even exist. As time passed, Cynthia's fear deepened. She had no idea what Beast and Lady G had planned for her, but she knew it wasn't good. They had already taken her money, but they wanted more. They had discovered that she was married to a man with some wealth, and now they were using her as a leverage. They demanded more money from her, forcing her to contact Jude, even though she was ashamed and terrified of what he might say. Meanwhile, back in Owerri, Jude had no idea of the danger Cynthia was in. All he knew was that she had left him for another man, and the pain of her betrayal weighed heavily on his heart. He had tried to move on, focusing on his daughters and doing his best to care for them. But Cynthia's absence left a void that was impossible to fill. He couldn't understand how their marriage had fallen apart so quickly, and he struggled with the idea that the woman he had loved was now with someone else. Cynthia, trapped and scared, was forced to reach out to Jude. Beast and Lady G demanded that she ask Jude for more money, threatening her life if she refused. With no other option, she made the call, her voice trembling with fear and regret. Jude was stunned when he heard from her. After everything she had done, he never expected to hear her voice again. But as she explained her situation, his anger quickly turned to concern. The woman he had once loved was in danger, and despite everything, he couldn't just let her suffer. Cynthia's call for help was a cry of desperation. She had lost everything, and now her only hope rested on Jude's willingness to help her. She knew that she didn't deserve his forgiveness, but she had no choice. She hoped that despite everything, Jude would find it in his heart to save her from the nightmare she had fallen into. While Jude processed the shocking news, Cynthia's situation grew worse. Beast and Lady G had no intention of letting her go until they got what they wanted. Cynthia's hope rested entirely on Jude's decision to act. She could only wait and pray that they would save her from the mess she had created. Despite his hot feelings, Jude knew he couldn't leave her to suffer. Deep down, no matter what had happened between them, she was still the mother of his children, and he couldn't turn his back on her in her time of need. He decided to take action, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. Jude quickly called his friend, a detective who had helped him with cases in the past. He explained the situation, telling him that Cynthia had been kidnapped in Port Harcourt by a couple who were demanding ransom. The detective immediately took the case seriously and promised Jude that they would do everything they could to find her and bring her back safely. What Jude didn't know at that time was that Cynthia had sent the address of the location to her best friend Oledo before she arrived in Port Harcourt. Oledo had been worried about Cynthia's trip from the beginning, and when she received the address, she kept it just in case something went wrong. When Jude told Oledo what had happened, she quickly gave him the address. The detective wasted no time. With the information from Oledo, he and his team traced the location where Cynthia was being held. They worked swiftly and quietly, gathering the details they needed to make their move. Time was on the essence, and they knew that Cynthia's life was in danger. Meanwhile, Cynthia was sitting in fear, waiting for what would happen next. Beast and Lady G had already taken everything they could from her, but they weren't finished. She knew that as long as they didn't get the money they wanted, her life was at risk. She couldn't stop thinking about the terrible mistake she had made, leaving her family for a stranger, and how her greed and foolishness had led her into this nightmare. As the detectives closed in, Cynthia's fear grew. She had no idea if Jude would help her or if anyone would come to her rescue. All she could do was wait and pray that her situation would somehow be resolved. Finally, the detectives arrived at the hideout. Moving in quickly, they surrounded the building and arrested Beast and Lady G before they could flee. Cynthia, who had been held captive for days, was found inside, badly hurt and bruised from the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her captors. She was shaken, ashamed, and deeply regretful of her choices. When the detectives brought her out, Cynthia couldn't believe that she had survived. She was overwhelmed with guilt, knowing that she had betrayed her family and destroyed her life for a fantasy that had turned into a nightmare. Jude, hearing the news that Cynthia had been rescued, felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. While he was grateful that she had been found, the damage to their relationship had already been done. Cynthia's choices had torn their family apart, and although she had survived this ordeal, the future of their marriage was unclear. As Cynthia was taken to the hospital to recover from her injuries, she couldn't shake the feeling of shame. She had lost everything: her dignity, her family, and her peace of mind. She didn't know if Jude would ever forgive her, and more than that, she didn't know if she could forgive herself. Cynthia lay in the hospital bed, bruised and beaten, but alive. The physical pain was bad, but the emotional weight she carried was far worse. The once confident woman who had thought she could escape her family for a life of excitement was now reduced to someone filled with shame and regret. Everything she had done, all the choices that had led her to this moment, seemed foolish and reckless. She had ruined her marriage, hurt her children, and nearly lost her life in the process. As she lay there, Cynthia's mind drifted to her family. She had once believed that leaving Jude and her daughters behind for a man she barely knew would bring her happiness. But now, in the cold, sterile hospital room, she realized just how wrong she had been. All those moments when she had ignored her responsibilities as a wife and mother came flooding back, overwhelming her with guilt. She thought about Jude, the man she had once loved but had taken him for granted. He had always been there for her, providing for their family, caring for their children, and supporting her in everything. Yet, she had chosen to leave him behind for a fleeting fantasy with a stranger who had deceived her. That decision had not only broken her marriage, but had also shattered the trust Jude once had in her. Her daughters, Omasere and Omalicha, were another painful reminder of her failure. They had looked up to her as their mother, depending on her for guidance, love, and care, but she had been too busy chasing her online life, too absorbed in a world that wasn't real, and she had abandoned them when they needed her most. The thought of their innocent faces, confused and hurt by her actions, pierced her heart. Cynthia knew that she had let them down and she wasn't sure if she could ever make it right. As the days passed, Cynthia remained in the hospital, recovering from her injuries. The physical pain began to ease, but the emotional burden only grew heavier. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost everything, that the life she once had was gone forever. Her thoughts constantly returned to Jude and their children, wondering what would happen next. Would Jude ever forgive her? Could their daughters ever trust her again? These questions haunted her every moment. Jude, on the other hand, was facing his own internal battle. While he was relieved that Cynthia had been rescued, the scars from her betrayal were deep. He had loved her deeply, and her actions had torn his heart apart. The pain of knowing that she had left him for another man, someone who had nearly taken her life, was something he couldn't easily forget. He wrestled with feelings of anger, sorrow, and confusion. Jude also had to think about the future. His first priority was always his daughters, Omasere and Omalicha. He had worked hard to protect them from the chaos that had entered their lives because of Cynthia's choices. But now, with Cynthia back and recovering, he was faced with difficult decisions about what their family's future would look like. Could there ever be a family again after what had happened? Or was it time to let go of the past and move on? The girls themselves were also struggling to understand the situation. They had been told that their mother was in the hospital, but they didn't fully grasp why she had left or why she had been in danger. All they knew was that their mother had been distant for a long time and they weren't sure if things would ever go back to the way they were. Cynthia's life had gone out of control, and after all the chaos, she couldn't bear the thought of returning home to face her husband, Jude. The shame she had carried weighed heavily on her heart, and she knew that confronting the reality of her actions would be one of the hardest things she would ever have to do. Instead of going home, Cynthia sought refuge at her best friend Oledo's house. Oledo had always been there for her, but even she couldn't fix the mess Cynthia had made of her life. Cynthia had to face her choices, and the consequences were about to catch up with her. Jude had already taken steps toward ending their marriage. He had filed for divorce after Cynthia's betrayal, and his heart was no longer tied to the woman he once loved. The pain she caused had left deep scars, and Jude, while no longer angry, had moved on emotionally. His focus was now on providing stability for their two daughters, Omasere and Omalicha. Jude had also grown closer to Lucy, the nanny who had been a great help during this difficult time. Lucy had become an important part of their lives, and as the days passed, Jude found himself developing feelings for her. Meanwhile, at Toledo's house, Cynthia's guilt began to consume her. Every day, she thought about how badly she had messed up as both a wife and a mother. She had walked away from her family for an illusion, leaving behind the people who had loved her the most. Cynthia began to realize just how much she had taken for granted. Her marriage to Jude, her children, and the stable life she had. None of it had been enough for her at the time. She had believed that there was something better out there. But now, standing on the other side of her choices, all she felt was regret. Cynthia opened up to Oledo, confessing how ashamed she felt. She admitted to being a terrible wife and how she had failed as a mother to Omasere and Omalicha. She had been so caught up in her own desires that she had forgotten about the most important things in her life: family and love. Oledo, though saddened by her friend's situation, urged Cynthia to try and make amends. She encouraged Cynthia to speak to Jude, to apologize, and to ask for forgiveness. Oledo believed that if Cynthia truly wanted to fix things, there was still a chance to at least salvage some part of her relationship with her children, if not her marriage. Cynthia knew that going to Jude would be difficult. She had walked out on him, broken his trust, and left their daughters confused and hurt. But now, more than ever, she wanted to make things right. She couldn't erase what had been done, but she hoped that her family would give her the opportunity to show that she had changed. One day, Cynthia gathered her courage and decided to go to Jude's house. She was filled with nerves as she made her way to the place that had once been her home. With each step she took towards the front door, memories of her time with Jude and the girls flooded her mind. The laughter they once shared, the closeness they had as a family, she had thrown it all away. Now, standing on the doorstep, Cynthia knew that this was her last chance to make things right, or at least to say goodbye properly. When Jude opened the door, the air between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Cynthia could see that the man standing in front of her was no longer the same person she had left. He was different, stronger, more than resolved. And though he wasn't angry, there was a sense of finality in his demeanor. Inside, Cynthia saw her daughters, Omaseri and Omalicha, sitting in the living room. They looked up at her, their faces a mixture of surprise, confusion, and sadness. Cynthia's heart broke when she saw them. They had grown since she had last seen them, and it was clear that they had learned to cope without her. Still, they were her daughters, and seeing them brought a rush of emotions she couldn't contain. Cynthia began to speak, her voice trembling as she expressed her deep regrets for abandoning them. She admitted to making terrible choices and acknowledged the pain she had caused. She told them how much she had missed them and how sorry she was for everything. Omaseri, the older of the two, listened quietly, processing her mother's words. Omalicha, though younger, looked at her mother with a wide eyes, trying to understand why things had changed. Cynthia pleaded for forgiveness, hoping that her daughters would give her a second chance. She had been selfish and she knew it, but she was willing to do whatever it took to make amends. Omasere, always the more mature one, remained silent for a long moment. She had been hurt deeply by her mother's absence, and the wounds of that betrayal were still fresh. Omalicha, being younger, was more forgiving, and though she was still confused, she wanted to see her family happy again. Jude, who had been listening from the side, finally stepped forward. He had heard Cynthia's apology, and while he appreciated her honesty, he knew that things between them were beyond repair. His focus was no longer on rebuilding their marriage, but on ensuring that their daughters had a stable and loving home. Jude spoke to Cynthia calmly but firmly, explaining that family had moved on without her. He reminded her that family was the most important thing and that love, not marital gain or fleeting desires, was the foundation of any lasting relationship. Though Cynthia begged and pleaded, hoping for a chance to fix her mistakes, Jude remained resolute. He handed her the divorce papers, making it clear that their marriage was over. It was time for Cynthia to move on and start a new chapter of her life. Jude had already made up his mind about what was best for their daughters, and Cynthia knew that there was no changing that. With tears in her eyes, Cynthia signed the divorce papers, realizing that the life she had once known was truly gone. She had lost her family, her marriage, and her role as a mother. Jude had made it clear that their paths were now separate, and though it was painful, Cynthia had to accept it. As Cynthia left the house, she felt a deep sense of loss. The reality of her situation hit her like a wave, and she knew that she would never have the chance to go back to the life she had taken for granted. Her children had forgiven her, but things would never be the same. Jude too had moved on, and there was no room left for her in the life they were building without her. Cynthia walked away from her old life, knowing that she had no choice but to move forward. She had learned a hard lesson about the value of family and the dangers of chasing something that wasn't real. Now, all she could do was try to rebuild herself, hoping that one day she might find peace. Cynthia walked away from Jude's house in tears, clutching the divorce papers in her hand. It was a painful and shameful end to the life she had once taken for granted. She had lost everything: her marriage, her family, and her sense of purpose. The regret weighed heavily on her as she left the house, knowing that there was no going back. The chapter of her life that had once been filled with love and happiness was now closed, and she was left alone to face the consequences of her actions. As Cynthia made her way back to her friend Oledo's house, her mind raced with thoughts of everything she had lost. Jude had made it clear that their marriage was over, and she couldn't blame him. She had abandoned him and their children for a fantasy that had quickly turned into a nightmare. Now, all she had left were memories of the life she had destroyed. While Cynthia had hoped for forgiveness from Jude, she knew that it was too late to repair the damage. He had moved on, emotionally detached from her, and focused on giving their daughters the stability they needed. And as much as it hurt Cynthia to admit it, Jude had found that stability with someone else, Lucy, the nanny who had been there for him and the children during Cynthia's absence. Jude had developed feeling for Lucy, and it was clear that their connection had grown deeper over time. Lucy wasn't just the nanny anymore. She had become a mother figure to Omasili and Omalicha. The girls adored her, and Jude had come to rely on her as a partner in raising them. While Cynthia had been chasing after something that didn't exist, Lucy had been there, providing the love and care that the family needed. As Cynthia walked away, she could hear the sound of laughter coming from the house she once called home. It was a reminder that life was moving on without her. Jude, Lucy, and the girls were finding happiness again, and she was no longer a part of it. The thought was so painful, but Cynthia knew that she had no one to blame but herself. Inside the house, Jude felt a sense of relief as Cynthia left. It wasn't that he didn't care about her anymore. It was just that their relationship had run its course. Too much had happened, and there was no going back to the way things were. He had already made up his mind to start a new chapter of his life, and Lucy was a part of that future. Lucy, who had been quietly watching from a distance, stepped forward after Cynthia left. Jude turned to her, his expression softening. In the time since Cynthia had left, Lucy had become an integral part of the family. She had stepped into the role of caretaker, not just for the children but for Jude as well. He appreciated her kindness, her patience, and the love she showed to his daughters. It was clear to him now that Lucy was the woman he wanted by his side. Though Jude had been hesitant at first, unsure of how to move forward after the pain of his failed marriage, he knew that his feelings for Lucy were real. She had been there for him during his most difficult moments, and she had helped him heal from the heartbreak of Cynthia's betrayal. Over time, their bond had grown stronger, and Jude realized that He wanted Lucy to be more than just the nanny. He wanted her to be a part of his life, and more importantly, a mother to his children. Jude, feeling confident in his decision, asked Lucy to marry him. He wanted her to be the mother figure that Omasiri and Omalicha deserved and help him build a new life for their family. Lucy, who had also grown to love Jude and the girls, agreed without hesitation. She had already come to think of them as her family, and the idea of becoming a permanent part of their lives filled her with joy. When Jude and Lucy told Omasiri and Omalicha the news, the girls were overjoyed. They had grown close to Lucy, and they couldn't imagine life without her. The family embraced in happiness, knowing that they were about to start a new chapter together. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope and optimism in the house. Jude, Lucy, and the girls were ready to move forward, leaving the pain of the past behind them. Meanwhile, Cynthia returned to Oledo's house, feeling more lost than ever. She had hoped for a chance to make things right, but Jude's decision was final. The reality of her situation hit her harder than ever. She had no home to return to, no family to care for her, and no future with Jude and the girls. The life she had once known was truly over. But as the days passed, Cynthia began to reflect on the lessons she had learned. She had spent so much time chasing after something she thought would bring her happiness, only to lose everything in the process. Now, standing on the other side of her mistakes, she realized that true happiness had been in front of her all along. It had been in her family, in the love of her husband and children, but she had taken it all for granted. Though it was painful, Cynthia knew that she had to move on. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how she lived her life going forward. She made the decision to become a better person, not just for herself, but for her daughters. Even though she wasn't a part of their daily lives anymore, she still wanted to be a mother they could be proud of. Cynthia threw herself into rebuilding her life. She found a job, started focusing on herself, and began working through her emotions. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of her mistakes felt unbearable. But slowly, she started to find a sense of purpose again. She couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she could learn from it. Her relationship with Omasiri and Omalicha remained distant, but she stayed in touch with them as much as she could. Over time, she hoped to rebuild the trust she had lost. She knew it would take time, but she was willing to wait. The most important thing now was to be a better person and to live a life that was honest and true. As for Jude, he and Lucy built a new life together with their daughters. The love they shared was built on trust, mutual respect, and the understanding that family came first. The past was behind them, and they were ready to face the future with hope and happiness. Cynthia's journey wasn't over, but she had learned one of life's hardest lessons. Happiness doesn't come from chasing fleeting desires or illusions. It comes from appreciating what you have and nurturing the love that is already there. Though her path had been difficult, Cynthia was determined to move forward with grace and gratitude, knowing that she had the power to change her future, even if she couldn't change her past. In the end, Jude, Lucy, and the girls found peace and joy in their new life together, while Cynthia, though on a different path, learned to find contentment in her own journey toward redemption. And with that, my dear friends, our story comes to a close. But remember, the magic of storytelling lives on, waiting to whisk us away on new adventures, where the wonders of imagination know no bounds. Goodbye for now, and may your dreams be filled with joy, wonder, and endless possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please kindly comment, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.